I am Ryan, 34 years old, and I spent 7 years saving every penny from my software development job to afford my downtown apartment. My mother has always favored my younger sister Jessica, but I never imagined she would demand I hand over my home. Last month she gave me a 48-hour ultimatum: sign my apartment over to my unemployed sister, or she would destroy my reputation with damaging secrets. What she never expected was the manipulation file I created in response. Drop a comment letting me know where you are watching from, and hit that subscribe button if you have ever dealt with manipulative family members. Trust me, you will want to see how this ends. Growing up in a middle-class Chicago suburb, I always felt like I was living in Jessica's shadow. Our home looked perfect from the outside, a 2-story colonial with a well-maintained lawn and friendly neighbors who waved as they passed by. But inside those walls, a clear dynamic was established early on. Jessica, 5 years younger than me, could do no wrong in our mother's eyes. When Jessica wanted the last piece of cake, my mother would insist I give it to her. When she broke my science project the night before it was due, earning me a failing grade, my mother said I should have kept it out of her reach. When I made honor roll, my mother barely noticed, but when Jessica brought home a single B+ among C's, the celebration lasted for days. Our father Robert was a quiet, hard-working man who spent most of his time at his accounting firm. When he was home, he would occasionally give me a knowing look across the dinner table when my mother praised Jessica for accomplishments that paled in comparison to mine. He never directly confronted my mother about her favoritism, though. I think he had learned long ago that challenging Catherine Williams was a losing battle. The summer after my freshman year of college, my father had a massive heart attack while working late. He died before the ambulance could even get him to the hospital. I was 19. Jessica was 14, and our family dynamic shifted dramatically. Without my father as a buffer, my mother became even more blatant in her preferential treatment. While Jessica was promised a fully funded college education, I had to work 2 jobs alongside my computer science studies. I worked mornings at a coffee shop near campus, attended classes during the day, and then pulled evening shifts at the campus IT help desk. Weekends were spent doing freelance web development projects for local businesses. Sleep was a luxury I rarely afforded myself. Despite the exhaustion, those years taught me self-reliance and discipline. By the time I graduated, I had built enough of a professional portfolio to land a job at a respectable tech firm. I started in an entry-level position but quickly moved up as my bosses recognized my work ethic and technical skills. For 3 years after college, I lived in a tiny studio apartment with just enough room for a bed and a desk. I saved relentlessly, putting aside at least 40% of each paycheck. My coworkers often invited me to happy hours and weekend trips, but I usually declined. Every dollar saved was one step closer to having a place I could truly call my own. When I finally had enough for a down payment, I spent months searching for the perfect apartment. I eventually found a 1-bedroom unit in a renovated building downtown. It was not huge, about 800 square feet, but it had large windows that filled the space with natural light, exposed brick walls that gave it character, and a small balcony where I could enjoy my morning coffee. Most importantly, it was mine, bought and paid for with my own hard-earned money. The day I signed the mortgage papers was one of the proudest moments of my life. At 27, I had accomplished something substantial without any help from my family. I invited my mother and Jessica to a small housewarming gathering, half hoping my mother would finally show some pride in what I had achieved. She did come, but spent most of the evening pointing out all the things that needed improvement. The kitchen was too small. The neighborhood was not prestigious enough. The building did not have a doorman. And she made sure to mention multiple times how Jessica would have chosen somewhere with more closet space. Despite my mother's criticism that apartment represented my independence, it was tangible proof that I could succeed on my own terms. For the next 7 years, I continued to advance in my career while making my apartment truly my own. I upgraded the appliances, installed custom bookshelves, and carefully selected furniture that balanced comfort and style. Meanwhile, Jessica bounced between college majors before eventually graduating with a general studies degree. My mother never mentioned how much this extended education cost, but I suspected it was substantial. After college, Jessica cycled through a series of jobs, never staying anywhere longer than a few months. Each departure was always someone else's fault, according to her and my mother. 3 months ago, Jessica lost her most recent job as an administrative assistant at a law firm. According to her, her boss was unreasonable about her taking long lunches and occasionally arriving late. Within a week of her termination, she had moved back into our childhood home with our mother. It started with small requests. Could I help Jessica update her resume? Would I mind putting in a good word at my company? Could I loan her money for a professional outfit for interviews? I agreed to the resume help, but explained that my company had no positions matching her qualifications. I also suggested she use some of her savings for the outfit, which earned me a cold shoulder from both Jessica and my mother for a week. The requests gradually became more demanding. My mother called asking if Jessica could stay at my apartment for a few days to get some space. I reluctantly agreed, only to return from a business trip to find my refrigerator empty, wine bottles in the trash, and unknown stains on my couch. When I mentioned this to my mother, she accused me of being petty and materialistic. Then came the suggestion that I should co-sign for Jessica to get her own apartment, since she was struggling to find one with her spotty employment history. I firmly declined, explaining that I was not comfortable taking on that financial risk. My mother did not speak to me for 2 weeks after that. Looking back, I can see that these escalating requests were testing my boundaries, seeing how far they could push me. It was as if they were gradually preparing for something bigger, something that would soon blindside me completely. The evening had started innocently enough. My mother called on a Wednesday, her voice overly sweet, as she invited me to dinner at her house that Friday. She mentioned she was making my favorite meal pot roast with roasted potatoes, a recipe my father had loved. It had been weeks since our last conversation ended in tension over the co-signing issue, so I cautiously accepted her invitation, hoping this was an olive branch. I arrived at 6:30, a bottle of red wine in hand as a peace offering. The familiar scent of pot roast filled the air as my mother opened the door, her smile tight but present. Jessica was already seated at the dining table, scrolling through her phone, barely looking up to acknowledge my arrival. My mother took the wine with a nod of approval. It was a small thing, but it gave me hope that the evening might go smoothly. We engaged in surface-level small talk through the appetizer of Caesar salad. My mother asked about my work, and I shared news about a promotion I had recently received. Jessica remained mostly silent, occasionally shooting glances at our mother. It was during the main course, as I was complimenting the tenderness of the pot roast, that my mother set down her fork with deliberate precision. The soft clink against the plate seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Her expression shifted, the polite hostess mask falling away, to reveal a calculating look I recognized from childhood confrontations. "Your sister is going through a difficult time, Ryan," she began, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she used when her decisions were not up for debate. "We have been discussing what would be best for her future." I nodded cautiously, taking a sip of wine to brace myself for whatever was coming. My sister finally looked up from her plate, a strange mixture of entitlement and anticipation in her expression. "Jessica needs stability right now," my mother continued. "A fresh start. Somewhere she can build a new life without the constant stress of financial insecurity." I found myself nodding again, still not seeing where this was heading. Did they want me to help her find a job at another company? Recommend a financial advisor? "I have decided that the most sensible solution is for you to give your apartment to your sister," my mother stated as casually, as if suggesting I lend Jessica a sweater. The wine I had just swallowed threatened to come back up. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. "I am sorry, what?" "Your apartment. It is perfect for Jessica. The location is close to several potential employers. The mortgage is already half paid off, and it would give her the fresh start she needs." I looked between them, waiting for someone to laugh to indicate this was some bizarre joke. Neither did. Jessica was now openly staring at me, expectant, as if waiting for me to hand over my keys right there at the dinner table. "That is my home," I finally managed to say. "I worked for years to afford it. I cannot just give it away." My mother's expression hardened. "We are not asking you to give it away. We are asking you to give it to family. To your sister, who needs it more than you do right now. You make good money. You can buy another place." The casual dismissal of my hard work of the years of sacrifice felt like a physical blow. I set down my fork, my appetite completely gone. Jessica, perhaps sensing my resistance, jumped in. I would take really good care of it, Ryan. Better than you do, honestly. And Mom said you can stay with her until you find a new place. The audacity of her statement stunned me into momentary silence. My apartment was immaculate, something Jessica would know if she had bothered to clean up after herself during her stay. This is not happening, I stated firmly, pushing my chair back slightly. I am not giving Jessica my apartment. I am happy to help her job hunt or review her resume again, but my home is not on the table. My mother's eyes narrowed dangerously. A look I remembered from childhood, usually preceding some form of punishment. Well, I had hoped you would be reasonable about this, Ryan. But since you are being difficult, let me be clear, you have 48 hours to sign over the apartment to your sister. 48 hours, I nearly laughed at the absurdity. Or what? My mother took a slow sip of her wine before answering. Or I will make sure everyone in your life knows about certain incidents from your past. Your employer might be particularly interested in what happened during your sophomore year of college. And those new friends you are so fond of, I wonder how they would feel about the real Ryan Williams. My blood ran cold. During my sophomore year, overwhelmed with working multiple jobs while maintaining a full course load, I had made a desperate mistake. I had helped several classmates cheat on a computer science exam, writing code for them in exchange for cash I desperately needed for textbooks. We had been caught, but due to my previously spotless record and a compassionate professor who recognized my financial struggles, I had been placed on academic probation rather than expelled. It was a stupid mistake born of desperation, one I had disclosed to my current employer during the hiring process, but the way my mother was framing it sounded far more sinister. As for my friends, I had no idea what she was referring to, but the threat was clear: comply or be destroyed. Mom, that is blackmail, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She shrugged. That is such an ugly word. I prefer to think of it as motivation. Family helps family, Ryan. Jessica needs this, and you are in a position to provide it. I am simply making sure you do the right thing. Jessica was now smiling openly, already envisioning herself in my space. Did you think about where I would live? I asked her directly. You can find a new place, she answered dismissively. You always land on your feet. I pushed back from the table and stood up. This conversation is over. I am not giving either of you my apartment now or in 48 hours. My mother's voice stopped me as I reached for my jacket. 48 hours, Ryan. After that, I start making calls. I have contact information for your boss, you know. And those photos from Jessica's stay at your apartment could be very interesting to your landlord. Would they allow you to keep your lease if they knew about the little gathering you hosted? I froze. There had been no gathering. I rarely entertained at home, preferring to meet friends at restaurants or bars. But it dawned on me that Jessica could have had people over during her stay, violating my building's strict noise policies, and now my mother was threatening to frame it as my doing. Without another word, I walked out, my mind racing. The drive home was a blur, my thoughts careening between disbelief, anger, and genuine fear. My mother had always been manipulative, but this escalation to outright blackmail was shocking. I barely slept that night, tossing and turning as I replayed the conversation and weighed my options. Give up my home to appease them. Fight back and risk my professional reputation. Run away and start over somewhere new. When morning came, bringing with it no clarity, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. I needed time to think, to plan. As I sat at my kitchen counter nursing a cup of coffee and watching the sunlight creep across my hardwood floors, a realization dawned. This pattern of manipulation had gone on my entire life, and it would continue indefinitely unless I took decisive action. I would not be giving up my apartment, but I also would not be passively waiting for my mother to follow through on her threats. It was time to change the dynamic permanently. The more I thought about my mother's ultimatum, the more I realized that this was just the latest in a lifelong pattern. For as long as I could remember, my mother had used guilt, threats, and emotional manipulation to control me and favor Jessica. I had always given in, always tried to keep the peace, but this demand was too far. The realization hit me like a lightning bolt. I needed evidence. If my mother was going to threaten my reputation with twisted versions of past events, I needed to document her pattern of manipulation. I needed to create a record so compelling that it would make her think twice about coming after me. I opened my laptop and created a new folder, titled Family Documentation. It was a bland name that would not immediately reveal its purpose if anyone happened to glance at my screen. Inside this folder, I began my work. First, I searched through years of emails. My mother preferred email for her longer manipulative messages, perhaps because it gave her time to craft her words carefully. I found dozens of examples, guilt trips about missing family events when I was working extra shifts, passive-aggressive comments about my life choices, explicit comparisons between me and Jessica that always found me lacking. I saved each relevant email into a subfolder, adding brief notes about the context and my recollection of what was really happening at the time. For instance, an email criticizing me for missing Jessica's 21st birthday failed to mention that I had been hospitalized with pneumonia that weekend, a fact I documented with a screenshot of my medical portal, showing the dates. Next came text messages. My phone contained a treasure trove of manipulative texts, especially from the past few years. There were the midnight demands for money when Jessica had overspent her allowance, the threats to cut me out of the family if I did not attend holiday gatherings, the dismissive responses when I shared personal accomplishments. I screenshotted each conversation, being careful to include the dates and full context. Some of the most damning were recent exchanges about Jessica staying at my apartment and the subsequent damage she had caused, which my mother had brushed off as insignificant. Social media proved to be another valuable resource. My mother had a habit of presenting our family as perfect online while behaving very differently in private. I found posts praising Jessica's minor achievements while major milestones in my life went unmentioned. There were also several public posts that subtly put me down, framed as jokes or casual observations. I also had photos from my apartment showing the state Jessica had left it in after her stay empty, liquor bottles hidden in my recycling bin, a cigarette burn on my couch despite my building's strict no smoking policy, and a broken shelf in my bathroom cabinet. I had taken these pictures intending to show my mother the damage, but had ultimately decided it was not worth the conflict at the time. Now they served as evidence of Jessica's disregard for my property and my mother's dismissal of legitimate concerns. As the first day of my 48-hour window ticked away, I reached out to several friends who had witnessed my mother's behavior firsthand. My college roommate Marcus had seen my mother berate me publicly at graduation for not achieving the same Latin honors Jessica later received at her high school graduation. My former girlfriend Rachel had been present during a holiday dinner where my mother had criticized every gift I gave while praising Jessica's dollar store offerings. I asked these friends if they would be willing to provide brief written statements about what they had observed. Many agreed, expressing relief that I was finally standing up to the toxic dynamic. Their statements sent as emails were added to my growing file. The financial section of my documentation was particularly powerful. I created a spreadsheet detailing all the money I had given or loaned to my family over the years. There were the checks to my mother when Jessica needed emergency dental work not covered by insurance, the loan for my mother's roof repair that was never repaid, the countless times I had covered Jessica's portion of family gifts or dining bills. Over 7 years, I had provided nearly $30,000 in financial support, none of which had ever been acknowledged as significant or repaid. I attached bank statements and check images as proof. Perhaps the most damning evidence came from recorded phone conversations. After the ultimatum dinner, I had started recording all calls with my mother and sister, which was legal in our state, as a one-party consent jurisdiction. These recordings captured my mother reiterating her threats about exposing my past to my employer and friends. They also caught Jessica laughing about how easy it would be to take over my apartment and how much better she would make it look. Organizing all this evidence was emotionally draining. Each manipulative message, each hurtful comment, each unfair comparison forced me to relive moments I had previously tried to brush aside. I found myself taking frequent breaks, stepping onto my small balcony to breathe deeply and remind myself that documenting these patterns was the first step to breaking them. By late afternoon on the first day, I had compiled a substantial digital dossier. I organized everything chronologically, creating a timeline that clearly showed the escalating pattern of manipulation. I wrote an executive summary at the beginning outlining the key instances of emotional manipulation, financial exploitation, and the recent escalation to outright blackmail. The result was a comprehensive 27-page document with links to audio files, images, and supporting statements. I called it the manipulation file. Looking at it, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and validation. Seeing everything laid out so clearly confirmed that I was not overreacting or being selfish by refusing to give up my apartment. This was the culmination of a lifetime of emotional abuse. I saved multiple copies of the file in different locations: my laptop, a secure cloud drive, and a USB stick I kept in my safe. I was not taking any chances with this evidence. That night, as I reviewed what I had compiled, I realized something important. Creating this file was not just about defending myself against my mother's immediate threat. It was about finally acknowledging the unhealthy dynamics that had shaped my entire life. For the first time, I was seeing the full picture of how I had been treated, and it was both heartbreaking and liberating. I slept better that night than I had in years, despite the looming deadline. I had a plan now, and more importantly, I had the truth documented in a way that could not be denied or twisted. With one day remaining before my mother's deadline, I knew I needed to strengthen my case further. The manipulation file was already substantial, but I wanted it to be irrefutable. I also realized that if this pattern of behavior extended beyond just me, additional perspectives would make the documentation even more powerful. I started by reaching out to my mother's sister, Aunt Diane. We had never been particularly close, primarily because she lived in Oregon and visited infrequently. However, I remembered moments from family reunions where she had given my mother disapproving looks when she obviously favored Jessica. I called Diane early that morning, explaining that I needed to discuss something important about my mother. Her immediate response was telling, "Oh, Ryan, what has she done now?" Over the next hour, Diane shared stories that confirmed my experiences were not isolated incidents. My mother had always been manipulative, even as a child. She told me how my mother had manipulated their parents, gotten Diane in trouble countless times, and even sabotaged Diane's college scholarship opportunity by deliberately misplacing an important letter until after the deadline. The pattern had continued into adulthood. When their parents died, my mother had somehow convinced them to leave her 70% of their estate despite an original plan to split everything evenly. Diane had suspected undue influence but had not been able to prove it. "Would you be willing to write down some of these incidents?" I asked hesitantly. "I am creating a record of my mother's manipulation because she is currently threatening me." Diane did not hesitate. She emailed me a detailed account within hours, adding several incidents I had not known about. She also suggested I contact my father's brother, Uncle James, who had distanced himself from our family after my father's death. Uncle James proved even more forthcoming than Diane. After my father died, my mother had apparently tried to claim sole ownership of a small vacation cabin that had been in my father's family for generations. James had to hire a lawyer to protect the property, which was legally supposed to be shared among all of my father's siblings. "I will send you the legal documents," James said. "Your mother tried to forge your father's signature on a transfer deed. We kept it quiet to protect your father's memory, but maybe it is time the truth came out." By midday, I had statements from 3 additional relatives, all describing similar patterns of manipulation, dishonesty, and favoritism. I added these to my file, creating a new section titled Family Pattern of Behavior. Next, I decided to seek professional insight. I called a therapist I had seen briefly after my father's death and scheduled an emergency session for that afternoon. I was not sure if she would remember me after all these years, but it was worth trying. Dr. Karen Miller not only remembered me but seemed genuinely concerned when I explained the situation. I showed her portions of my documentation and described the current ultimatum. "What you are describing is a clear pattern of emotional abuse and what we call parental favoritism," she explained after reviewing the materials. "This type of sustained manipulation can cause significant trauma to the unfavored child. The fact that it has escalated to outright blackmail is extremely concerning." "Would you be willing to provide a professional assessment of these dynamics for my records?" I asked. Dr. Miller agreed, and by the end of our session, she had written a clinical evaluation describing the patterns of emotional abuse evident in the communications I had shown her. She also provided me with resources about setting boundaries with toxic family members and recommended continued therapy to address the long-term effects of the favoritism I had experienced. Her clinical assessment added significant weight to my documentation. It was no longer just my perception. A mental health professional had confirmed the abusive nature of the relationship. My next stop was a consultation with a lawyer. I was not planning legal action, but I wanted to understand what protections I might have if my mother followed through on her threats. The law firm could only fit me in for a 30-minute consultation, but it proved invaluable. Attorney Michael Rodriguez reviewed my documentation and the nature of my mother's threats. What she is doing could potentially constitute blackmail or extortion depending on the exact nature of the threats and what she is demanding, he explained. Recording conversations without consent is legal in this state as long as one party consents, which would be you. If she follows through on spreading false information about you to your employer with the intent to damage your reputation that could constitute defamation, Rodriguez wrote a brief legal assessment outlining the potential claims I might have against my mother if she followed through on her threats. He also suggested a cease and desist letter as a potential next step, though I decided to hold off on that option for now. Armed with these professional assessments, I returned home to organize the new information into my file. The additions transformed the documentation from a personal account into something far more authoritative. It now included family historical context from multiple relatives, clinical assessment from a mental health professional, legal evaluation of the threats and potential remedies, financial documentation showing a pattern of one-sided support. As evening approached, I worked on organizing everything into a compelling narrative. I wanted anyone who reviewed this file to immediately understand the pattern and its severity. I created a table of contents, added page numbers, and wrote section summaries that highlighted the key points. I even created a timeline visualization showing how the manipulation had escalated over the years. The final touch was a section I called Reasonable Resolution. In it, I outlined what I considered fair boundaries moving forward. I would maintain ownership of my apartment. I would help Jessica with job searching, but not with direct financial support, and all future interactions would need to be respectful and free from manipulation or threats. By midnight, the manipulation file had grown to 43 pages of meticulously documented evidence, professional assessments, and first-hand accounts from multiple sources. It told the story not just of the current ultimatum, but of a lifetime of manipulation and favoritism. As I finalized the document, I felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time, I was seeing the full picture of my family dynamics from an objective perspective. What had always been dismissed as just how our family works was revealed as something much more troubling. The documentation process had been painful, but it was also clarifying. I was not the problem. I never had been. With only hours remaining before my mother's deadline, I prepared for the confrontation to come. I printed 2 copies of the complete file, placing them in professional-looking binders. One would remain with me, the other would be my mother's copy should she want it. I also prepared a digital presentation on my tablet highlighting the most compelling evidence in case showing the full physical document proved impractical. Finally, I saved an electronic copy to my phone, ensuring I would have access to it regardless of the circumstances. As the sun rose on the day of the deadline, I felt ready. The anxious, people-pleasing son, who would have done anything to avoid conflict, had been replaced by someone new, a man with evidence, boundaries, and the courage to stand up for himself. The deadline was set to expire at 7 p.m., exactly 48 hours after my mother had issued her ultimatum. I decided to arrive at her house at 5:30, giving us plenty of time to talk before the arbitrary cutoff. I dressed in a way that made me feel confident and composed, a crisp blue button-down shirt, dark jeans, and the watch my father had given me for my college graduation. The manipulation file sat in a sleek black portfolio on the passenger seat of my car. I had rehearsed what I would say, anticipating various reactions and preparing responses. This would not be a shouting match or an emotional plea. This would be a calm, factual presentation of evidence. The drive to my childhood home felt surreal. The familiar streets and landmarks seemed unchanged, yet I was arriving as a different person than I had been just 2 days ago. The process of creating the file had shifted something fundamental in me. I was no longer willing to be the family scapegoat. I parked in the driveway behind Jessica's car. Through the living room window, I could see both my mother and sister inside, seemingly engaged in animated conversation. They were probably discussing what they would do with my apartment once I surrendered it. The thought steeled my resolve. My mother opened the door before I could knock, her expression a mixture of triumph and impatience. She was dressed formally, as if preparing for an important business meeting rather than a family discussion. Jessica hovered just behind her, barely containing her excitement. "Right on time," my mother said, stepping aside to let me in. "Do you have the paperwork? I had my lawyer draw up a deed transfer. All you need to do is sign." She gestured to several official-looking documents spread out on the coffee table. I noted with grim amusement that they had already gone so far as to prepare legal paperwork, so confident were they in my compliance. "Actually, I have some documents of my own I would like to discuss." "First," I replied, calmly patting the portfolio under my arm. My mother's smile faltered slightly, but she waved me toward the living room sofa. "Fine, but let us not waste time. The 48 hours are almost up." I sat down across from them, placing the portfolio on my lap, rather than immediately opening it. I wanted to establish the tone first. "Before we discuss the apartment, I want to make something clear," I began. "I have spent the past 2 days reflecting on our relationship and the patterns that have defined it. I have come to some realizations that I think we need to address." Jessica rolled her eyes dramatically. "Are you seriously going to turn this into some therapy session? Just sign the papers, so I can start moving in this weekend." I ignored her, keeping my focus on my mother, whose expression had shifted from triumphant to wary. "You issued an ultimatum that I transfer ownership of my apartment to Jessica, or you would attempt to damage my reputation and career with information from my past. That is blackmail." "It is being a mother," she countered. "Sometimes children need to be pushed to do the right thing." I shook my head. "No, it is blackmail. And it is also the culmination of a lifelong pattern of manipulation and favoritism that I have decided to document thoroughly." I opened the portfolio and removed the bound manipulation file, placing it on the coffee table between us. My mother glanced at it dismissively. "What is this supposed to be?" "This is a comprehensive record of your manipulation tactics, threats, and the favoritism you have shown Jessica throughout our lives. It includes emails, text messages, financial records, witness statements, clinical assessment from a therapist, and legal evaluation of your recent actions." My mother's dismissive expression faltered. She reached for the file, flipping it open to the table of contents. Her eyes widened slightly as she scanned the list of sections. "This is ridiculous," she scoffed, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "You compiled some old family squabbles and are trying to frame them as some sort of abuse. No one will take this seriously." "Multiple people already have," I replied evenly. "Would you like to hear what your sister Diane had to say about your history of manipulation? Or perhaps what Dad's brother James shared about the vacation cabin incident after Dad died?" The color drained from my mother's face. Jessica, who had been examining her nails with bored indifference, suddenly looked up with interest. "What vacation cabin incident?" she asked. Instead of answering her directly, I pulled out my tablet and opened it to the audio recording section. "Let me play you something," I said, tapping on a file from 2 days ago. My mother's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. 48 hours, Ryan. After that, I start making calls. I have contact information for your boss, you know." I stopped the recording and looked at my mother. Her face had hardened into a mask of anger, but there was something else in her eyes now. Fear. "That is taken out of context," she snapped. "Is it?" I asked, scrolling to another recording. "This one from this morning where you told Jessica, and I quote, 'Once Ryan signs over the apartment tomorrow, we should have the locks changed immediately. I do not trust him not to make a copy of the keys.'" Jessica shifted uncomfortably on the sofa. "You recorded our conversations. That is so creepy." "It is actually perfectly legal in this state," I replied, "and it proved necessary given the nature of your plans. Would you like to hear more? Perhaps the call where Mom suggested selling my furniture to pay for your new decorating scheme." My mother stood up abruptly, her hands clenched at her sides. What exactly is your point with all this? So I pushed you to help your sister. That is what families do. I remained seated, maintaining my calm demeanor. My point is that your ultimatum ends today. I will not be signing over my apartment to Jessica or anyone else. And if you proceed with your threats to contact my employer or friends with distorted versions of my past, I will be forced to share this entire file with our extended family, your friends, and your colleagues at the charity board. My mother's face went from angry to shocked. You would not dare. I stood up slowly, matching her gaze. I have spent my entire life trying to earn your approval and support the kind you have always freely given, Jessica. I have provided financial help, emotional support, and practical assistance whenever asked. In return, I have been manipulated, dismissed, and now blackmailed. So yes, I would absolutely dare. Jessica, perhaps sensing that things were not going as planned, jumped in. This is insane. You are acting like Mom is some kind of monster, just because she asked you to help me out during a rough patch. I turned to her, maintaining my composure. Jessica, this file documents 17 separate occasions where I have provided you with financial assistance in the past 5 years alone. It also includes photos of the damage you did to my apartment during your stay, which violated my building's policies and could have jeopardized my lease. I have helped you repeatedly. What I will not do is give you my home. The concrete examples seemed to momentarily silence her. My mother, however, was not so easily deterred. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. If you think I will not follow through on my promise to contact your company, you are mistaken. One call about that cheating incident in college, and your precious career will be in jeopardy. It was the moment I had been waiting for. I smiled slightly. I already disclosed that incident when I was hired. My boss knows I helped other students in exchange for money during a financially desperate time. Chapter 1. What he does not know, but would certainly be interested to learn, is that my mother is attempting to use that 20-year-old mistake to blackmail me out of my property. My mother blinked rapidly, processing this information. You told them. Of course I did. It was a mistake I made when I was 19, and desperate for money because my college fund had mysteriously been redirected to Jessica's private high school tuition. This was a fact I had only recently pieced together from old financial documents, and the look on my mother's face confirmed my suspicion. She had used money that had been set aside for my education to send Jessica to an expensive private school, leaving me to work multiple jobs to cover my expenses. The room fell silent for a long moment. My mother stared at the manipulation file on the coffee table, perhaps truly seeing for the first time the extent of what she had done. Jessica looked confused, the narrative she had been fed her entire life, that she was simply more deserving, beginning to crack. I picked up the file and returned it to my portfolio. I have another copy for you, if you would like to review it in detail. Either way, my position is firm. The apartment remains mine. The blackmail attempt stopped today. And moving forward, our relationship will need to be based on mutual respect, not manipulation or threats. My mother sank back onto the sofa, the fight seemingly gone out of her. How dare you do this to me, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. After everything I have done for you. I thought about responding to this last attempt at guilt manipulation, but decided against it. The evidence spoke for itself. Instead, I zipped up my portfolio and headed for the door. I will give you both some time to process this. When you are ready to have a respectful conversation about healthy boundaries moving forward, you know how to reach me. As I walked out, I heard Jessica ask in a small voice, Mom, what did he mean about my high school tuition? I closed the door behind me, cutting off whatever response my mother might have given. The confrontation had gone largely as I had expected, though the lack of a dramatic showdown was somewhat anticlimactic. There had been no shouting, no tearful confessions, no immediate reconciliation. What there had been, however, was a fundamental shift in power. For the first time in my life, I had set a boundary with my mother and sister, and held firm. The manipulation file had done exactly what I had hoped it had shown them, that the old tactics would no longer work. As I drove away from my childhood home, I felt lighter somehow, as if I had set down a burden I had been carrying for decades. The road ahead might be complicated. Our relationship might need significant rebuilding, but the foundation would be different now. It would be built on truth, not manipulation. The drive home from my mother's house was surreal. After years of acquiescing to her demands and walking on eggshells to keep the peace, I had finally stood my ground. The weight that lifted from my shoulders was almost physical, as if gravity itself had lessened its hold on me. I had barely walked through my apartment door when my phone began buzzing with notifications. 3 missed calls from my mother, 2 from Jessica, and a series of increasingly frantic text messages. From my mother, "Call me immediately. We are not finished discussing this." From Jessica, "What did you do to Mom? She is completely freaking out." From my mother again, "That file is full of misunderstandings and exaggerations. You are blowing everything out of proportion." I silenced my phone and took a moment to reconnect with my space, walking through each room of my apartment. This was my home, purchased with years of hard work and sacrifice. The exposed brick walls, the hardwood floors, the small balcony where I grew herbs in the summer. All of it represented my independence and achievement. I had almost allowed them to take it from me. After taking a shower and changing into comfortable clothes, I finally checked my phone again. 5 more missed calls and several new messages. The latest one from my mother caught my attention. "We need to talk. Not about the apartment. About some of the things in your file." This was unexpected. I had anticipated continued anger, or perhaps a silent treatment, but not a seemingly genuine request to discuss the contents of the manipulation file. Still, I was not ready to re-engage so quickly. I needed time to process the confrontation and establish my new boundaries firmly in my own mind. I sent a brief reply. "I need some space right now. We can talk next week, when emotions have cooled." Then I turned off my phone, completely, something I rarely did. This night was for me, for reclaiming my sense of self and celebrating my newfound strength. The next morning I woke to the sound of knocking on my door. Peering through the peephole, I was surprised to see Jessica standing alone in the hallway, shifting nervously from foot to foot. Against my better judgment, I opened the door, keeping the security chain engaged. "Can we talk?" she asked, her usual confidence notably absent. "Just me. Mom does not know I am here." Curiosity got the better of me, and I let her in. Jessica had never visited my apartment without our mother's orchestration, and she had certainly never sought me out for a one-on-one conversation. She stood awkwardly in my living room, taking in the space, as if seeing it for the first time. "Your place is really nice," she admitted. "You have done a lot with it since I stayed here." I gestured for her to sit down, but remained standing myself. "What do you want to talk about, Jessica?" She sank onto the edge of my couch, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "After you left yesterday, Mom had some kind of breakdown. She locked herself in her bedroom with that file you gave her and would not come out for hours. When she finally did, she was different, weird. She kept saying she needed to make things right." I raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. Jessica looked down at her hands. "She told me things, Ryan. About Dad's college fund for you, that she used for my school. About how she made you pay for my car insurance while telling me Dad had left money specifically for it. About a lot of things." I sat down across from her, surprised by this development. "And I did not know," she said quietly. "I mean, I knew she favored me, that was obvious. But I thought the money and help came from her, not from you. I thought she was just being generous with her own resources." Part of me wanted to point out that Jessica could have questioned these things, could have wondered why her unemployed mother suddenly had money for her expenses while her brother worked multiple jobs. But I recognized that she had been manipulated too, just in a different way. "What do you want from me, Jessica?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. She looked up, tears in her eyes. "I do not know. To say I am sorry, I guess. And to ask what happens now. Mom is talking about selling the house, moving into some tiny apartment. She says she needs to make amends. This was more change than I had anticipated. I had expected my mother to be angry, perhaps to lash out, but not to immediately accept responsibility and take such dramatic action. The house is mostly paid off, I pointed out. There is no reason for her to sell it. Jessica nodded. That is what I told her. But she says she needs to pay you back for all the money she took from you over the years. She was up all night making a spreadsheet of everything she could remember. I was stunned. The manipulation file had been intended as a defensive measure, a way to protect myself from my mother's threats. I had not expected it to trigger such a profound reaction. She does not need to sell the house, I said firmly. I am not looking for repayment, just respect and an end to the manipulation. Jessica wiped at her eyes. I am looking for a job for real this time. I have 3 interviews lined up next week, and I am moving out of Mom's house. I found a roommate situation that I can afford with my savings until I start working. I studied my sister's face looking for signs of the usual manipulation, but all I saw was a confused young woman whose understanding of her family had been upended overnight. That sounds like a good plan, I said carefully. Jessica nodded, then asked the question that was clearly weighing on her. Are we ever going to be okay? As a family, I mean. I considered this seriously. The damage done over decades could not be repaired in a day, regardless of how dramatic my mother's reaction had been. Trust would need to be rebuilt slowly, if at all. I do not know, I answered honestly. That depends on whether Mom's current remorse translates into lasting change and whether you and I can build a relationship that is not defined by her favoritism. Jessica nodded again, accepting this uncertain answer. She stood to leave, then hesitated. For what it is worth, your apartment really is nice. But I need to find my own place. Earn it like you did. After she left, I turned my phone back on to find several missed calls from extended family members. Apparently, my mother had been making calls of her own, not to damage my reputation as threatened, but to confess her behavior and apologize. Aunt Diane had called twice. Uncle James had left a voicemail expressing his pride in me for standing up for myself. And even my father's elderly cousin had texted to say she had always known something was off in how my mother treated me. At work, the following Monday, I found myself moving through the day with a new confidence. Colleagues commented on the change with my team lead, noting that I seemed more assertive in our morning meeting. Standing up to my mother had affected how I carried myself in all aspects of my life. By the end of the first week after the confrontation, a new pattern had begun to emerge. My mother sent a formal email not pushing for contact, but acknowledging the contents of the file and expressing a desire to make amends when I was ready. Jessica texted occasionally with updates on her job search, careful to keep the messages respectful and without any requests for help. I maintained my distance, using the space to continue my own healing process. I scheduled regular sessions with Dr. Miller, the therapist who had contributed to my file, focusing on understanding how the years of manipulation had shaped my self-perception and relationships. As the weeks passed, the changes in my family dynamic seemed to be holding. My mother did not sell the house, but did make a substantial donation to a scholarship fund at my alma mater in my name, a symbolic gesture of returning what she had taken from my college fund. Jessica secured a job at an insurance company and moved in with 2 roommates, texting me a picture of her first paycheck with obvious pride. I began to cautiously reconnect with extended family members who had reached out after hearing from my mother. Many expressed regret for not recognizing or intervening in the dysfunctional family pattern earlier. These reconnections helped fill in gaps in my understanding of our family history and provided a support network I had not realized was available to me. 3 weeks after the confrontation, I agreed to meet my mother for coffee at a neutral location. She arrived early, visibly nervous, a far cry from the confident, controlling woman who had issued ultimatums less than a month before. The manipulation file sat between us on the table, its pages now dog-eared and marked with sticky notes. My mother had clearly spent considerable time with it. I have been seeing a therapist, she said after our initial awkward greetings. She says I have narcissistic tendencies, and that I used you as what she calls a scapegoat child. I nodded, unsurprised by this assessment. And what do you think? My mother took a deep breath. I think she is right. I think I convinced myself that favoring Jessica was somehow helping you become more independent, more resilient. But really, I was just repeating patterns from my own childhood. It was the most self-aware statement I had ever heard from her. We talked for an hour, not resolving everything, but establishing a framework for moving forward. There would be boundaries, expectations of respectful communication, and a moratorium on any financial entanglements. As I walked her to her car afterward, she paused. I am not asking for forgiveness, Ryan. What I did was wrong and it went on for too long. But I am asking for a chance to show you that I can change. I did not make any promises, but I did agree to continue our conversations. It was a start, small but significant. 6 months passed since the day I presented the manipulation file to my mother and sister. Half a year of significant changes, gradual healing, and the careful reconstruction of what it meant to be part of my family. The transformation was not instantaneous or complete, but it was real and ongoing. My apartment remained mine, of course. In fact, I had recently repainted the living room and replaced the couch that had been damaged during Jessica's stay. These small changes symbolized something larger, a reclaiming of my space and my autonomy. Each improvement was a decision made solely for my benefit, without consideration of what my mother or sister might think of freedom I was still getting used to. The most profound changes, however, were internal. Through consistent therapy with Dr. Miller, I had begun to recognize and counteract the deep-seated patterns instilled by years of being the unfavored child. I learned that my reflexive people-pleasing, my tendency to minimize my own achievements, and my difficulty setting boundaries were all adaptations to my upbringing. When a child consistently receives the message that their needs and accomplishments matter less than someone else's, they develop strategies to cope. Dr. Miller had explained during one particularly insightful session, your coping strategy was to become the reliable one, the problem solver, the one who never asked for anything in return. That served you as a child, but as an adult it was limiting your ability to form healthy relationships. With this understanding, I began the deliberate work of establishing healthier patterns. I practiced saying no without justification or guilt. I learned to recognize when I was taking on responsibilities that were not mine to bear. I became more comfortable acknowledging my own accomplishments and expressing my needs in relationships. My relationship with my mother had transformed into something I never could have imagined. After several months of limited, carefully structured interactions, we had established a new dynamic based on mutual respect rather than obligation or manipulation. My mother continued her therapy, working to understand the roots of her behavior and develop healthier ways of relating to both her children. She had joined a support group for parents working to repair damaged relationships with their adult children, which seemed to provide her with both insight and accountability. The most tangible sign of her commitment to change was her respect for the boundaries I had established. She no longer dropped by unannounced made demands disguised as requests or attempted to use guilt to influence my decisions. Our interactions had a formality that might have seemed cold to outsiders, but represented significant progress for us. We had settled into a routine of meeting for lunch once a month at a restaurant halfway between our homes. These meetings were initially awkward, filled with careful small talk and deliberate avoidance of triggering topics. Gradually, they evolved into more genuine exchanges, though we both remained mindful of our history. During our most recent lunch, my mother had looked at me with an expression I was still getting used to, respect, mixed with a hint of regret. You know, you remind me more of your father every day, she had said. Not just in how you look, but in your integrity. He would be proud of how you stood up for yourself. I wish he could see the man you have become. Coming from her, this was extraordinary. My father had always been spoken of as the practical one, the one who did not understand how special Jessica was. To hear my mother positively compare me to him represented a fundamental shift in her perspective. My relationship with Jessica had undergone its own evolution. After securing her job at the insurance company, she had immersed herself in learning the business, discovering an aptitude for the work that surprised everyone. Perhaps herself most of all. Her natural charm and social skills, previously directed toward getting others to solve her problems, were now channeled into building client relationships. 3 months after starting her job, she had been promoted to a team lead position. She had called me immediately with the news, her voice bright with genuine pride. I got this completely on my own, Ryan. No one pulled strings or made calls. I earned it. The fact that she felt the need to specify this revealed her growing awareness of how our family had functioned previously. It also showed that she valued achievement based on merit, something I had never been sure she understood. We were not close, Jessica and I, and might never be. Too many years of being positioned as rivals of unequal treatment and resentment stood between us. But we were developing something that might eventually become a genuine sibling relationship built on mutual respect, rather than the dysfunctional dynamic our mother had created. We occasionally met for coffee or a quick dinner, these interactions characterized by a tentative friendliness. Jessica no longer asked for money or favors, and I no longer felt the need to point out her privileges. We were in some ways getting to know each other for the first time. My extended family had also become more present in my life. Aunt Diane visited twice, staying in my guest room and sharing stories about my father as a young man. Uncle James invited me to the family cabin for a fishing weekend, a place I had not visited since childhood. These connections provided a sense of belonging and history that had been missing for much of my life. The manipulation file itself sat in a drawer in my home office. I had not opened it in months, had not needed its protection or validation. Its purpose had been served the moment my mother realized I had documented her behavior and was willing to share that documentation if necessary. The fact that I had created it, that I had been willing to stand up for myself even at the risk of family estrangement, had fundamentally altered our family dynamic. Perhaps the most unexpected outcome of this experience was how it had affected my other relationships. With the burden of family manipulation lifted, I found myself more open and authentic with friends and colleagues. I no longer felt the need to be the perpetual caretaker, the one who always accommodated others at personal cost. This new authenticity attracted different kinds of connections. I began dating someone who appreciated my boundaries, rather than testing them, who valued my directness, rather than seeing it as a challenge. My friendships deepened as I allowed myself to be vulnerable, to admit when I needed support instead of always being the supporter. At work, my increased confidence translated into a promotion. My manager specifically cited my improved ability to advocate for my team and stand firm on project requirements as factors in the decision. The skills I had developed to protect myself from my mother's manipulation were serving me well in professional negotiations. Looking back on the past 6 months, I could see how creating and using the manipulation file had been a pivotal moment in my life. It had not just protected my apartment, it had liberated me from a lifetime of manipulation. The documentation of my mother's behavior had made it impossible for her to deny or minimize her actions, forcing a confrontation with reality that ultimately benefited our entire family. The most profound lesson I had learned was that family relationships, like all relationships, should be conditional, based on mutual respect and care. The idea that we must maintain ties with family members regardless of how they treat us is a harmful myth that enables abuse and manipulation. I had also learned that standing up to manipulation often requires concrete evidence. Manipulators rely on gaslighting, on making their targets question their own perceptions and memories. Having documented proof of the manipulation pattern had been essential in breaking that cycle. Perhaps most importantly, I had discovered my own resilience. Despite years of being told explicitly and implicitly that my needs mattered less, that my achievements were less worthy of celebration, that my purpose was to support others rather than succeed myself, I had managed to build a life of accomplishment and integrity. The apartment that had nearly been taken from me had become more than just a home. It was a symbol of this resilience, of my ability to protect what was rightfully mine. Each mortgage payment was an affirmation that I valued myself enough to maintain boundaries, even when doing so was difficult. As I reflect on this journey, I wonder how many others are trapped in similar family dynamics, unable to break free because they lack documentation or support. If you are watching this and recognize patterns of manipulation in your own family, know that you deserve better. You deserve relationships based on mutual respect, not exploitation or control. Have you ever had to create documentation to protect yourself from someone who was manipulating you? What strategies have worked for you in setting boundaries with difficult family members? Share your experiences in the comments below. And do not forget to like and subscribe if you found my story helpful. Sometimes standing up for yourself means being willing to show others exactly what they have done, even when that truth is uncomfortable for everyone involved. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember, you have the right to protect your boundaries, your property, and your peace of mind.